So you guys know I'm here if you need me to field any of your questions.
All right, good. I still owe you a conversation because got to get on tick. Oh, Rick says, "Oh, we're going." Oh no, we're going. Okay, welcome. We are now on the air, as Andrea wanted to know. This is our weekly live stream. We do this at 10 a.m. Friday mornings, and I don't usually take questions from the chat. Vixen Dixon is in there first, as always, sporting her new little icon. Um, Daijin is second, as is often the case. Long live the Queen. And we are back to our regular questions and answers. And Rick this morning says we have hardly any questions. And then I looked in it and I'm neck deep in questions here. And they're hard ones too. So Joey recommends I spend an hour and a half on the first question and then try to get the rest of them done in a half hour, which is usually my pattern. So all right, I think we're good to go unless someone has a question from the chat room. So, like I was saying, I usually take questions from the PVK Q&A recorded session in the Bridges of Meaning Discord. Now, I know it's been difficult getting on the Discord server for some of you. I don't have this monster link that anybody and everybody can join because we had a little issue develop with that link, so I'm using other links and they don't always work. So leave a comment on a video if you're having difficulty getting in, and I can always drop a link in that way. Or someone else who's in the comment section can maybe share a link to get you onto the Discord server if that's where you're trying to go. So anybody have anything they want to say or any question they want to get in from the voice chat before I start making my way through this volume of difficult questions? And it's quite, it's the Bridges of Meaning voice chat for these is sort of like bringing your kid to the doctor, because I have 5 children, and when you bring your kid to the doctor, they can be sick all week, and you finally get into the doctor and the kid has no symptoms. And so you get people into the Bridges of Meaning Discord and they chat, and then you put them in this recorded stream session and they all clam up. So anyway, here we go. Dingo Dan, we're going to lead off with his question from March 4. Oh, we're still in March questions. Oh my. What does it mean for the physicality of Christ's resurrection to be necessary, and what is the relationship, if any, between that specific necessity, its propositional truth, and the general necessity of a given story to manifest if it's true? Is Christ's conquest of Rome and colonization of the world following his death in the Matterverse not enough of a physical manifestation of the story to satisfy it? It is not counterproductive. Is it not counterproductive, both in story and matter, for believers to harp on Christ getting a shiny new body on Easter when that body is the very thing the church is supposed to be? Those are really excellent questions. So I will say yes. Next question. No, it is an excellent question because you are very much tracking with my thinking. And as Sunday is Easter, and I'm by no means done with my Easter sermon, there might be two rough drafts. There might be a rough draft for Friday and a rough draft for Sunday this week, because I'm still pondering my Easter sermon, and it's following the lines of this question, that what happens in the resurrection is that Christ's resurrection, in terms of how that connects with the entirety of his life and ministry, gets pulled into time, physicality, and physical manifestations through the church into history. And so to your last question, I don't know that it's counterproductive for believers to harp on Christ getting a shiny new body, but C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles makes this point that the apologists almost always focus on the first 5 minutes. And Lewis says that in the ancient church, in fact, even, I'm going to have to see if I can do this today. I've got a weird toothache that I went to the dentist on Monday, and we took x-rays and stuff, and he says, well, I could do a root canal, I just don't know which tooth I would do it on. And so I've been battling a toothache all week until the tooth that is having the issue will manifest itself, at least sufficiently to the dentist, so he knows how to do violence against it. So I'm going to be battling this headache and this toothache throughout this for as long as I can stand it. So your point is well taken, that the body is the very thing the church is supposed to be, and that is absolutely theologically correct. And Jordan Peterson's observation that the church to him has been, I'll rephrase it, an insufficient witness to the resurrection, is a very true and condemning point for the church to have to recognize. The church is the body of Christ, and the church has never been as clear a witness as Christ himself was. Yet at the same time, we also have to ponder, which is in some ways part of the point of my Good Friday sermon this week. Christ, in his physicality prior to his passion, did not simply colonize the listeners of his sermons in that moment. In fact, most of the colonization of Christ's work has been happening both through the church and through his revelation, which is the Bible. And it's a strange thing, and it's something to think of with respect to time, that this colonization just continues to roll through history, using the Bible, using the church, and has grown. On Good Friday, which is celebrated today, he dies nearly alone, nearly abandoned. And now, 2,000 years later, millions and millions and millions of people will mark the event with a theological understanding that it only seems that an evildoer, being one of the people crucified with him, and a centurion had much of an inkling of, besides the people leaving the scene of the resurrection as they beat their breasts, as it says. So your question is excellent, and your point is well taken. Part of my emphasis on the necessity of not reducing the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus to mere symbolism is that none of us are happy enough or sufficiently satisfied with mere symbolism. We all desire to see the incarnation of our hopes and dreams. Let's say you are a student and you desire to be a doctor, which is a good desire. And so you study diligently in school to get good grades, to get into med school, and then you get into med school and you study some more and you build up enormous amounts of debt, and then you get a residency where you're staying up all kinds of crazy hours and you're doing all of this labor and suffering in order to achieve something. Saying that the resurrection is mere symbolism is sort of like saying that all of the study and suffering and sacrifice and debt you have built up in anticipation of becoming a doctor is sufficient, because all of the suffering is symbolic of being a doctor, when in the end you really want to be a doctor. And so it's that reason that if you sort of kneecap Christianity by saying that the resurrection is mere symbolism, you kneecap a good many of our hopes and dreams, because what we look for is full realization of the potential of the symbol. And we're quite rightly and understandably not satisfied unless that potential is realized. Now, part of Christian theology says this world is an insufficient platform for the final and full realization of the sign that is Christ. The Bible never says Christ isn't a sign. The Bible says Christ is more than a sign. So this leads us into, so in terms of Good Friday or tonight, the evildoer, as I mentioned in a little video that I made this week, Matthew and Mark call the persons that are crucified next to Jesus lesti, or insurgents, which is very historically correct. The Romans didn't crucify common thieves. Crucifixion was an act of political example making. So Matthew and Mark call the people next to Jesus brigands or insurgents, not thieves. Thieves is a very bad translation because it makes it sound like, oh yeah, somebody burgled your house and so Rome's going to put him up on a cross. That's not who they put up on crosses. One of those, Luke kind of flattens it out and calls them evildoers, and that sort of affords more participation of us into them, because we are all evildoers, because we all do evil. One of those evildoers says to Christ, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." That's an astounding thing to say, given the time and place. For us today, that wouldn't be anywhere near as astounding, because people commonly, whether they're Christian or not, have conceptualizations of reward or punishment in an afterlife, and that this world is not the only dispensation that we will participate in. Now, of course, certain atheists or materialists are skeptical about that. Even Steve Jobs, when he was facing his own death, commented to his biographer about, well, maybe there is something more. The evildoer on the cross says to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom," which suggests that Jesus' kingdom will come in this world, but that here in the age of decay, this world is not sufficient to finally embody that manifestation fully. And the New Testament riffs on that with seeing the church as the bride of Christ. And in the book of Revelation, part of the revelation is the revelation of the bride. But in the book of Revelation, part of that revelation is her and her suffering. And so the church often reveals Christ most brilliantly when she is suffering, not when she is being a tyrant. And this has been played out again and again in church history. So everything that I've said about Jesus and the resurrection and physicality, I continue to stand with. But as C.S. Lewis also points out in his book Miracles, when he talks about the resurrection is deeply connected to the ascension and to the second coming. Because basically what happens in the drama is that Jesus hangs around for a number of weeks after the resurrection, popping in and out. And in a very telling moment, he says to Mary on Easter, "Don't cling to me." There's something about Jesus' resurrected body that doesn't fit in this world, in the age of decay, in this dispensation, right here and right now. And so he ascends, and when he returns in the fullness of time, that will be the proper time, and a new creation that is able to manifest the potential of what we see in the crucifixion and resurrection will be inaugurated. That's essentially the Christian assertion. And so in the meantime, the church lives in this foothills world, or this twilight world, or creation, not yet creation 2.0, not merely creation 1.0, but sort of creation 1.5. It's a now and the not yet. And just as we saw in the life of Jesus, when you lean into the new creation within the dispensation of this creation, what you get is suffering. It's sort of like a freshwater fish in an estuary having to deal with salt. or a saltwater fish in an estuary having to handle the decrease of salination. The church is in some ways in a transition period. Christians are in some ways in a transition period. And this is part of the reason when Christians are overly triumphant, they aren't good witnesses of the Christ that doesn't fit in this world. Now, that sounded probably very confusing to a whole bunch of you, but if you want to ask any follow-up questions in the voice chat, go for it. But that's my best answer within an hour and a half for that first very excellent, very difficult question. And it's a good way to start, given that this is Good Friday and Sunday is Easter. All right, second question. Can you oh, go ahead. I thought I heard someone. Can you talk more about the idea that the world manifests itself through attention? Sure. Jonathan Peugeot was using that quite a bit when he's talking to Jordan Peterson. The point of that, okay, let me roll back to modernity. Not only do we each of us work from individual maps that we construct in our head that are molded into us as first drafts from our parents and from our primary experience almost right from the beginning of when we have consciousness, we also work from communal maps. The majority communal map in modernity is this idea of objectivity first. That the world is a place of objects, that it is fundamentally static, that its parameters, even though we can't say they are known, that its parameters are somehow known. It's sort of a communal monarchical vision. Now, that's a very helpful, powerful cultural move on modernity's part to afford a lively community of science and technology, which the West has excelled at over the last few hundred years. But that world is as much a map as any other map of the world. The strength of it is that to a degree that you can create consensus around some combination of empiricism and rationality, you can host a very powerful society. And that's exactly what has happened in the world. The difficulty of that is that world is itself a map. And that world struggles with the question of the individual and individual attention, consciousness, and opinion. And so the compensating effort for that deficiency in the map of modernity is individualism. And the way those two worlds have sort of worked together within, say, downstream of Christianity has been a whole regime of rights. And there have been certain categories of people, protected classes, as they're called legally. And these categories of rights protect these individuals from the modern communal map. What we've been seeing is the intersectional proliferation of these protected classes. And very early on, when Jordan Peterson was talking about intersectionality, he said quite rightly, if you keep following the trail of intersectionality, you come all the way back to the individual. Because each of us, as individuals, can participate in some form of historical oppression. And it doesn't matter how privileged your particular class is, if you dig far enough, you will come to a point in which your class was oppressed. So let's pick blonde-haired, blue-eyed men that Hitler thought was a master class. Well, when Julius Caesar conquered Gaul and brought slaves into Rome, it was probably the case that blonde hair might have been as associated with slavery as dark skin, and African features became associated with slavery in the early modern period and the colonial period. These are simply historical artifacts of historical processes. And these things play out again and again and again and again and again in history. I had a friend in this church who died a number of years ago, but he grew up in Hawaii, and he was always called a haole. He was called a haole because it was clear from his physical features that he was not Hawaiian. So he was a minority culture in a majority culture, which was Hawaiian, but the Hawaiians were treated as minorities in a larger colonial frame, and so these frames just keep working out. So when Jonathan Pageau and talks to Jordan Peterson about attention, for each of us, the world that we see, not this modern mapping of a world of objects, but rather more a form for action, is our world. So in other words, you might be, on some mappings, a very privileged individual, but in your experience, you might be the victim of how many untold offenses at the hands of other people who are considered oppressed in other mappings. It just keeps going. So, sort of following Heidegger and a lot of 20th century philosophy, which attempts again to reinstall consciousness within a broader mapping, because part of the trick of modernity, I illustrate this by covering one eye, you take out individuality, you take out the person, you take out consciousness, and you can have a world of objects. But because of that movement, you're going to bump into limitations. So at some point you have to re-enter consciousness into the equations, and that's sort of where we're at, that the world manifests itself through attention. And we've illustrated this a number of times. The entire process of the learning of cognitive science has been an attempt to reintegrate this into our capacities. So I bought a new car a number of months ago, and this new car has a system, like many new cars do, where there are cameras in the front of it that are looking for things. They're looking for lines on the highway. They're looking for road signs that give the speed limit. And they're reading these things. Well, what computer scientists and cognitive scientists had to figure out was just slapping a camera on the front of the car doesn't give you anything. The camera has to see. They have lenses with which to see, but you need a computer with which to see. And what that programming needs to do is separate, basically do relevance realization to understand what these lines painted on the highway mean, what these rectangular white things on American highways with letters and numbers on them mean in terms of action. Jordan Peterson's first conversation with Sam Harris was all about this. Peterson kept trying to make the point to Sam that we don't just simply see the world as it is, that each of us pre-consciously are selecting the world that we experience. And so if, let's say, you're African American and you're living in a white society that has a long history of racial discrimination, let's say you live in Sacramento and you live in South Sacramento and you want to visit a church in Northern California, and you're going to drive through hours and hours and hours of rural countryside, and you're an African American and you get nervous. Why? because in your experience, whether firsthand experience or experience taught you by movies or news or all these things, you're safer in your ghetto. You're not safer out there in white rural America. That's a sensitivity that has been built into you. And that sensitivity is founded on some reasons. Let's say you grew up in a white suburb and you're going to travel to Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church, and you drive into the neighborhood and you look around and you see a lot of black folks at the AM PM and you get nervous. Why? Because the sensitivity has been built into you by the story of your upbringing, just like it has from the other person. So the world of rural California for a black person and the world of Florin Road, Sacramento for a suburban white person looks very different. The world manifests itself in attention, because the white suburban person who drives down to Florin Road sees all the black folks at the AM PM, a world is manifesting to them. The African American who is driving up to Shasta in Northern California and they see all kinds of pickup trucks at the gas station on the highway, the world is manifesting to them. I grew up in a weird space where I was a white person who grew up in a black community. And so I feel at home at the AM PM in South Sacramento with the black folks, but I also don't have a history of oppression. And so I can drive up to the beautiful national parks and not get a little anxious about all of the white rural pickup trucks that somehow have been associated with movies coming out of the American South, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the world manifests itself through attention. And those are just some illustrations of what Jonathan meant. And there are as many illustrations of this as there are individuals that have been formed by their experience. And so one person walks into a church that is festooned with rainbow flags and Black Lives Matter posters, and they say, I feel at home. Another person walks into there and is like, oh, this is the enemy. Someone from another continent walks into there, they're not even going to see the rainbow flags. They're not even going to see the BLM posters. They're going to walk in and they might say, oh, this has electric lights. And they might go into the bathroom and see these strange white chairs with holes and water in them and think, I have to relieve myself and there's nothing appropriate to do this. They're looking for a hole in the middle of a concrete floor. This is how we are, and there's no getting around it. What is some of the science that points to this? Well, it's the cognitive science, and it's all the Vervaeke stuff. It's a lot of the Peterson stuff. And as we have to deal with pluralism, which means that, I share a city with African Americans that get nervous around rural, symbolisms of rural whiteness. Some of that translated from the stories from their parents and grandparents who migrated out of the Jim Crow South. And we've got at the same time white suburbanites that have come down to the scary world of Florin Road. And we've got African Anglicans who are worshiping in this building and have all their own filters brought in from Nigeria, on and on and on and on. So what we're trying to do is find a mapping that works for all of the people. And that's really hard, and it actually takes a long time, longer than what we have to give it. And so what that means is that we make these little fudges and fixes that sort of smooth out the rough areas. But the deeper you get into multicultural, pluralistic community, the more often you bump into the collisions that happen. So it's a good question. It's a hard question, but there's my take on it.
Hey, fun fact is the word slave originally references the Slavic tribes of Eastern Europe.
Right. Right. And of course, when we think slave in America, we think black folks. Well, that's because of the particular history of slavery that is most salient to us. But like I was saying, it's quite likely that if you lived somewhere in Asia Minor or Italy or someplace in the Roman Empire in the first century, you see a blonde-haired person, everybody in the street stops and looks at them. Where did that blonde hair and that blue eyes come from? Well, they lost the war against Julius Caesar. There you go. All right. Next question. In one of your videos, you talked about spending some time thinking about how to reach out to the woke. I've been pretty cynical about there being hope, especially after Neil got canceled, deplatformed this week by Veritas. Any thoughts? Do you see a silver lining that I'm missing? There is always conflict. Part of the reason in my rough drafts lately I've been leaning hard on the Judean culture war is because there is always conflict. Conflict is a way by which we work out things. Now, conflict can be productive or counterproductive. Part of what I appreciate about Vervaeke's project is that he tries to address a lot of the, basically it's junk food and human relationality. And a lot of what goes on the internet is junk food. So I'll try to be fair to both sides. I have yet to do my review of Jesus and John Wayne. I think it's absolutely appropriate to demonstrate the relationship between American nationalism and Christianity in our culture. It's an absolutely appropriate topic for a historical book. It's an absolutely appropriate thing for a Christian pastor to critique. My disappointment in the book is that I didn't find any serious analysis of it. The book was basically a litany of, from her perspective, the sins of these people. Let's flip on the other side and look at a lot of the work that Ben Shapiro does. Ben Shapiro can spend all day owning the libs. And AOC or Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden, you can spend all day mocking, pointing out the sins, smacking your head, doing the entire political liturgy of castigating the opposition. Now, there's a place for that. And that's part of the political ecosystem too. But let's say these people are members of your family. You can forever have an argument about the sins of the other, but you can't. How can you actually stop them in their flaws? And how can you stop them? Well, re-educate, imprison, kill, exile. Or, well, would you actually like to have influence with the other side? That's a far more challenging thing. How can you do that? Well, you're probably going to, on one hand, have to have a degree of self-restraint. And you're going to have to be able to exhibit a degree of generosity. We know this about human beings. But part of what's difficult about our particular environment is that you can create a very lucrative YouTube channel or Twitter following or Instagram or political party by just throwing out the red meat and keeping the food fight going. But what you're probably not going to do is actually make progress on problems that all of us share. And in many cases, Ben Shapiro and Kristen Kobes de May want similar things. Do we want more or less poor in society? Do we want better or worse health care? Do we want more or fewer homeless? Now, they agree on the ends. They disagree on how to get there. Okay, well, let's figure out how to have a productive conversation on how to get there. Let's figure out how, and in a lot of ways, the food fight itself, I'm not also into exiling the food fight. You're going to have the food fight, and you can learn things from the food fight. But if the food fight is the only thing you've got, you're actually not going to make progress on anything. So, for example, I just read an article and tweeted it out about how people are leaving Portland and going to Boise, Idaho. And I see that all the time. People leaving California and they're going to Texas, or they're going to Utah, or they're going to Idaho. That's sort of how we do things. And we have states that are working different systems. And in some things, California might be ahead of Texas, and in other things, Texas might be ahead of California. California had wildfires. Texas had an electrical emergency. There's lots of things. And so what I'm asking for is, I think Neil Shenvi is doing us a service, because when I look at Neil Shenvi's blog, I see him as saving me a lot of time having to read all these books. Now, does Neil Shenvi have somewhat of an axe to grind in terms of his reading of these books? Sure. But I know Neil Shenvi's filters. I had a conversation with him on my channel. I heard his story. I did some probing in terms of, okay, how sophisticated is your understanding of this or that or this or that? To what degree do I agree with you or disagree with you? So Neil Shenvi is doing us a service. Ben Shapiro does us a service. Kristen Dumais does us a service. Let's figure out what service they do. Let's figure out if we can engage in productive conversation with them about what we're trying to do. Because in my experience, there's Ben Shapiro and Kristen Dumais have more in common than they have in opposition to each other. You see this all the time in families. Families have a tremendous amount in common, but they can fight like nobody else in a family and feel betrayed and hurt in a family like nothing else, because they have so much in common and they have so much riding on it. So I don't care how hopeless people think things are. Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it might not work. But this is part of the reason I also approach it as a Christian, because within my meta-narrative, in the end, the world is put right. And the creator of the universe finally accomplishes this. Now, he does it through time, and he does it through process. So, to me, the question is, how can we actually be productive? And what I think has been terrific about this moment of the IDW and the Jordan Peterson meetups is that I was, for a long time, a very reliable, voice sort of on the political left. And what happened via Jordan Peterson was we actually were able to have meetups, and we don't talk a lot of politics, but Joey is more conservative than I am. And so what this gave me was an opportunity to listen to people who had different opinions than I have, and I've benefited and grown by that. Now, that sets up a dynamic where someone in my denomination, let's say, I'm not saying this is her position on me at all, because she doesn't like my critique of her book that I posted on Twitter, and so I really should do a longer one on YouTube. But I don't want her to be my enemy, and I don't want Joey to be my enemy. Now, some people in my denomination might consider me a traitor. Well, everybody's entitled to their opinion. So if they want to consider me a traitor, I can't stop them. But that doesn't mean I can't love them, and I can't do my best to treat them with generosity and kindness. So that's the game that we're in the middle of. And you might say, well, where do I get these ideas? I think I get these ideas from Jesus, because that's what I see Jesus doing. Now, am I creating that view of Jesus through my own world of attention? To some degree, of course. It's inevitable. I can't escape it. But I don't see Jesus lining up with the Zealots or the Essenes or the Pharisees or the Herodians or the aristocracy or the Romans. I don't see Jesus lining up with any of those parties. I see Jesus eating with Pharisees and Jesus eating with tax collectors. And the Pharisees are really annoyed that Jesus is eating with tax collectors. And so before I am an American, I am a Christian. And what that's going to mean is I'm going to eat with Republicans and I'm going to eat with Democrats. And if I'm going to pastor a church, I want both parties represented in my church. And I want them to act in church as brothers and sisters in Christ that may go out into the world and vote for political parties. That's my demand. And so if people are going to hate me, they can hate me. But what they can't do is control me if I don't let them. So that's why, there's going to be, why Veritas canceled Neil, because what? He's not a theologian? I think that's silly on the point of Veritas. So maybe they have a reason for it. I don't know. Why I shouldn't judge them too harshly. I think they've done a lot of good work too. But it's been interesting that, it's usually the weaker side that wants conversation, and the stronger side that tends to want to retard conversation because they have the most to lose. That's another power dynamic. So, all right. I've answered a bunch of questions. I have to get a drink. Any comments from the voice chat? All right, I'll keep going. Brody, Paul, you recently tweeted this. Wokism is the child of Christian European philosophy trying to absolve itself of a variety of sins. This is a thoroughly Christian and European spat. Sneechers are still arguing about the numbers of stars. Can you expand on this a bit, as I find it a really interesting thesis? It's so funny because you've got all this intersectionality and all this conversation about intersectionality going on. What scholars developed all of this? I read quite a good thing on Twitter this morning. Social constructivism was weaponized by Karl Marx and his followers. Marx took Nietzsche's will to power and applied it to social institutions, particularly economic classes. He taught that cultural values and the institutions and artifacts that support them are the products of the dominant class and are designed to facilitate their oppression of the other groups. Thus, for Marx and Marxists, art, literature, laws, political ideologies, morality, and religions are all masks of power, hiding the relative agenda of the ruling class and making it palatable for those who are oppressed. For example, of the Middle Ages, the tale of knightly chivalry and heroism caused the peasants to admire the feudal masters. In our era, dominated by the middle class, the political ideas of individualism, democracy, and liberty are masks to validate capitalism and keep the wealthy bourgeoisie in power. For Marx, religion is the opiate of the people, keeping the masses fixated on a future life and anesthetizing their suffering so that they will cooperate in their own exploitation. Today, the post-Marxists adopt Marxist analysis, but apply it not just to economic classes, but to other dominant and oppressive groups. The rich still oppress the poor, as in classical Marxism, but other groups also construct reality to advance their will to power. Whites oppress blacks, men oppress women, heterosexuals oppress homosexuals, humans oppress animals, and intersectionality unites the disparate victim groups as they ally with each other to form a common front against the oppressors. On university campuses today, such as academic research is devoted to deconstructing these power relationships. Thus, marriage, the nuclear family, sexual morality, and opposition to abortion are unmasked as being constructions of the patriarchy, means by which men control women. Activists, in turn, on and off campus employ post-Marxist analysis and rhetoric to their own causes. Next one. If you are among the oppressed, you can repudiate the social constructions that bind you by purposefully transgressing the norms and by constructing your own alternatives. In the long run, though, the goal must be your group to gain power. This might happen in an inevitable Marxist revolution in which the workers overthrow the middle-class property owners, or in the particular communities and social spaces that your group controls, campuses, political parties, professionals, social media sites, etc. Thus, the much-discussed political correctness is, for the most part, a post-Marxist version of Marxist social control as seen in the former Soviet Union, in which certain ideas and ways of expressing them are not permitted. In such contexts, appeals to freedom of speech or academic freedom do not carry much weight, since they are more bourgeois ideas that are masks for capitalism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and other oppressive ideologies. Editors of the Oxford... Anyway, my point to all of this is all just simply steeps in European philosophy and history. You don't get woke without first getting European, no matter the skin color you have. And so you're thinking you're exploring all this authenticity when no, it's just the next turn of the wheel of the revolution. It's all it is. And so it's just a new colonialism, and the fact it's a new imperialism, and the fact that now you must go to Africa and use your new philosophy to liberate the Africans who the only reason they don't agree with you is because they're subject to colonialism, and now your new gospel is going to liberate them. Oh, and you're deconstructing colonialism while you're being just as colonial as 19th century Christians were when they abolished the slave trade and had women cover their breasts and made polygamy illegal? It's the same move. It's just as European, just as white. But you're just going to act like it isn't. Okay, but all of your ideas come from the same root. You know, it's just a lie. But the thing is, they might not even know it's a lie, because for them, that's just authentic. And I look at it and I just think, okay, I probably can't talk you out of it, but I'm not going to hate you for it. I'm not going to kill you for it, but I don't buy it. I don't buy it. And if you can show me your moral clean room from which, no, it's not coming from God, it's coming from where, that this grand revelation that you now suddenly have, which has been your great awakening, and you're foisting it on the rest of the world, and as colonial a manner as 19th century Britain did, show me. Everything you've shown me right now says it's just the same game that we've been playing. And all right, go ahead and play it. I can't stop you, but I'm not going to join you, and I'm not going to hate you for it, because I've got my perspective too, and you haven't shown me enough to compel me to give my perspective up and join yours. So that's how I see it. But I don't want to, I watch myself with this stuff, and I can get all upset and on my own high horse and start being a jerk to people through it. And I don't like myself doing that either. So, I'll only watch so much. I only read so many James Lindsay quotes. I only watch so much John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry. I only listen to so much anti-woke stuff, and I just have to turn it off, because then the anti-wokeness colonizes me, and I don't want to do that. I need to figure out how to love my neighbor as myself. I'm not changing masters. I look at Jesus and I say, that's my master. I follow his way. And so wokeness will be around us, just like the Roman Empire, or just like zealotry in the first century. It'll be here. Anti-wokeness will rise to meet it. An opposition always arises. And it's going to be there. I might have opinions about different aspects of the food fight. You know, I've lived in African American communities all my life. When I travel with black folks to rural places and I watch them get nervous, understanding American history, I can have an understanding why they get nervous. If, you know, their ancestors lived for years in rural places where there wasn't a lot of law and the law wasn't by any means just, I can understand why black folks get really nervous and really angry when things happen. And okay, now we had some Asians who were killed. I can understand, given the history of racism against Asians in this country, why they get really nervous and really angry when they see a pattern. Okay, I get it. And I can understand why white folks get really nervous or angry if they're feeling threatened. When people feel threatened, they do violent, unjust things. And to me, the best answer I've seen for all of this is Jesus. But believing Jesus comes at a pretty heavy cost. Because Jesus says, they can kill me. They can kill me because they really can't. And in a materialist age, we listen to that and think, oh boy, that's a pretty big pill to swallow. And it is. And so Christians are always shrinking from it and betraying their Savior and playing other games. But as a Christian minister, it's my job to sort of, you know, you do this with young children. You find a kid who's freaking out about something. And what do? Maybe a 7 or 8 year old. You set him down, you take his little face, you get eye contact, you look him in the eye, and you say, let's talk, me and you. It's going to be okay. I'm going to be with you. Do you trust me? Let's see if we can work through this together. Hopefully that's what we do in the church. And the church can manifest us loving our enemies. That's my goal. All right. Paul, in this week's stream, your discussion of Chairman Mao made me wonder if there are degrees of punishment in the afterlife. People often imagine hell as Dante portrayed it, but I can't think of anywhere in the Bible that talks about levels of severity. That's true. Your point is, I think, correct. The Bible serves us evocative images of the afterlife. I think the reason that is all we have is because we don't have a frame of reference for it. So I'm again going through Luke this year, and there's in the Gospel of Luke, there's all these moments in the Gospel where Jesus is heading down to Jerusalem with his disciples. Something will happen. Jesus will pause, kind of settle him down, look him in the eye and say, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. We're going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be turned over into the hands of Gentiles. I'm going to be murdered, and I'm going to rise again. And again, the Gospel of Luke says they had no idea what he's talking about. And then, of course, Jesus gets arrested and tried and crucified, and his disciples hide. That they understood. And then Easter Sunday morning, they go to the tomb, and it's empty. And there's shiny guys. And they say, why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here, he's risen. And they look at him like a cow looks at a new gate, because we can't understand. Recently, I'm trying to remember which conversation it was in, but Peterson made the point. He was exactly right. We can only see, because our world is created by attention, We can only see that which is mostly within our frame of reference. The amount of difference or dissonance has to be just enough to grab attention, but not too much as to explode our filters. Now, if you look at trauma therapy, we've learned a lot about trauma in the last few decades. So you're sitting at home in the afternoon, your spouse or your child or a loved one has gone out to run an errand, and they've been gone a little while, and you see a police cruiser pull up, and you see an officer and someone with a windbreaker on that says chaplain walk up to your door. You have just seen enough to put yourself into trauma in all likelihood. You open the door because that's the script that's been built into you, and their lips move, and somewhere in your brain you've captured some tragedy, but you don't hear anything, and you don't remember anything. Let's say you're a small child, and your uncle in the middle of the night comes into your bedroom and wakes you up. Why is my uncle in my bedroom? And then your uncle puts his hands in certain places of your body and takes parts of his body and does things to you. And then your uncle goes away. As a child, something just happened to you, and you have no category with which to process it, because you've already had categories that have been processed in you, and you've had things built into you for generations past. That's trauma. What happens in the resurrection is, why is Jesus not here? And you might even have this if you go into your house. Let's say you went to work in the morning, you went to work, blah, 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 normal day. You came back home to discover your front door is busted. And you walk in the house and your dresser drawers are flown out on your bed. Your television is gone. The house is a mess. Your dog is nowhere to be found or lying dead on the floor. What do? You don't know what to do. I was sitting in my office one Tuesday. I got a phone call from my mother. He's gone. Huh? She had texted earlier, Dad had collapsed. Now I got a phone call. He's gone. I sit in my office. I message my wife. My father just died. My wife messages back. What are you doing? I'm sitting in my office. Well, get up out of your office, go home, pack your bags, get an airplane ticket, fly to Massachusetts. Okay. This is how we are. We don't know what to do. So, images of the next world, we simply have no frame of reference for. And so we have these evocative images that translate things to us, upon which we continue to construct things. And so there are clearly images of degrees of reward in Scripture. And so might there be degrees of punishment? And so Christian theology tends to extrapolate. That's what we do. We build on these evocative images. But, and then when Jesus gets these, next life questions, questions about marriage. Well, in the next age, there won't be married or given in marriage. What does that mean? So Peter Kreeft was often asked the question, is there sex in heaven? And Peter Kreeft has one of the best answers for that. He says, the problem with this question is it makes me think more about sex in this world. So we don't know a lot. And we work on images, and we use these images to encourage each other for faithfulness and for sacrifice and for hope, because those are needed in this world. And so that's what we do. So, Richard, Zurich 04. The weak and the strong in Romans 14 and similar passages from Paul have always been a stumbling block for me. In my struggle with how to regard homosexual desires, I have always maintained a traditional view. In my experience, however, it can be more of a stumbling block for some homosexual Christians, potentially including myself, to attempt to keep to the traditional standard. The standard argument about the possibility of a quasi-Christian ideal marriage is not one that can be easily dismissed. And for me personally, Paul's concession in 1 Corinthians 7 is a particularly potent example of the ideal marriage, considering my struggle with pornography. If we ever get a chance to speak together, I hope we dig into these issues in their wider context. But I hope that today you can provide some thoughts to further my journey. Each of us have to deal with the hand that we've been given. And in that hand are certain strengths and weaknesses, certain temptations, certain opportunities, and that's all within a cultural context. The cultural context for people who, let me say a few things. I remember when I was in Calvin Seminary in the 80s and the subject of same-sex attraction came up. And I remember our professor of pastoral care said, it's probably not fair to categorize anyone in terms of gay or straight before the age of 25. Well, that's an interesting tidbit. I had a conversation with a Christian psychologist this week who was fretting over the fact that he might have to treat, as a therapist, someone who is at a very young age imagining themselves to be have gender dysphoria. That's a difficult thing, because sort of what happens in a culture is that there are always these illnesses and solutions du jour. So let's say you're struggling with depression. Let's say you're struggling with body issues. Well, right now, a common answer is, well, maybe you're in the wrong body. And so suddenly ideas like puberty blockers and hormone therapies are on the menu. I suspect 20 years from now, there's going to be a lot of angry people with the prevalence of the story that's going around today, because a bunch of people took a bunch of drugs and lost a bunch of physical capacities that they would normally have enjoyed and been able to make use of. But because of a fad, a medical fad, a psychological fad, permanent damage was done to their bodies. Each of us are responsible for the agency we possess. And the agency we possess is seen against a backdrop of a whole bunch of other things going on. And so, stronger brother, weaker brother, I doubt Paul was talking about these matters with respect to that. And that is integral. He was usually talking about things like meat sacrificed to idols. And that whole question of spirits and objects, and to what degree can objects be sacred, is a very difficult one, and that gets into a lot of these Barfieldian participation questions. And so Paul, from a certain perspective, said, I can walk into the temple of Diana, and, that's an image of stock and stone. Doesn't faze me. Another person can walk into that temple, and attention creates a very different world for them, and they'll have a stumbling block. And different people by different cultures will have different experiences in this. Anyone who has experienced, well, first of all, same-sex attraction is not an unusual thing. And there is a huge variability with human beings with respect to same-sex attraction. It is also the case that human beings are sort of like malleable rivers. There are degrees to which things can be encouraged and enhanced, and degrees to which, and limits to which that can happen. And this is very true in terms of human sexuality. You want to give someone a fetish, do something to them in a particular way at a certain age, and there's probably a percentage chance you can create that fetish in that person. We know this about people. So, on one hand, I think it's progress that we're not hurting people who experience same-sex attraction the way past generations have. I think in the process, we have set up people who perhaps for one reason or another experience same-sex attraction at a higher rate than others, or in a more persistent way than others, to set them down a course that in past generations they wouldn't have had to wrestle with. You know, it's sort of like no-fault divorce. On one hand, if divorces are hard to get and you have to state your reason before a judge and have a judge sign off on your divorce, well, some people who really need to get out of their marriage have a hard time getting out. And that's a sad thing. So make divorce easy. Now you've got a different problem where people who should probably stick it out and learn to address some things in themselves, and maybe if they work on it 4 or 5 years later, their children will be better off and they'll actually find joy in their marriage and so on and so forth. They can do better, but making divorce easy has sort of wrecked that. Maybe you've got a situation where you've got a couple that they don't have enough money to get divorced, so they stay together. And in the process of staying together, they actually work it out. And you've got another situation where they have enough money to get divorced. And so you look at this with Hollywood stars. They get divorced all the time. None of them can make a marriage work because they don't have to. Life is like that. And Paul, in terms of talking about meat sacrifice to idols, is dealing with those sort of dynamics that, well, let's say you grew up in a particular Roman town that had a particular popular shrine, and the particular manifestations of that god has formed certain strengths and weaknesses in this individual. They just can't go near that temple because they stumble. I can walk through a liquor aisle all day long and not have any problem with it because I don't like to drink. I don't like the taste of it. Never have, for some reason. I know other people that they don't even want to go into the supermarket that has a liquor aisle because it is, or there's a day they don't want to go down. So, you know, this is an issue that in time the church will wrestle with. And we will know in 100 or 200 years more than we know now. And it kind of sucks to be someone for whom it's a real issue right now. You know, I was watching one of these crazy marriage shows, and there was this guy in this. It was like this show where they just couldn't see each other. They were talking in these little booths, and then after, you know, they basically they had to propose in the little booth. What kind of maniac torture people are making these shows. Anyway, so they propose, this man proposed to this woman, and then they're all in some hotel where they can meet each other face to face, and they can, canoodle a little, and all this stuff that this reality TV stuff is made of. And all along the way, because of course they're not only talking to each other, but they're talking to the producers, this guy basically says, well, I've got a secret that I've kept from her that I didn't tell her about until I haven't told her about yet. So then they get by the swimming pool, and he's talking to her, and he says, oh, by the way, I consider myself not straight, but bi, and I've had relationships with men before, and I'm really hoping that, you're really my first significant relationship with a woman, and I really want to have a family someday, and I really hope that this works out. And okay, now you've got a film crew right there. And both of these individuals are African American, and the valence of this in the African American community, as opposed to, let's say, a lot of white communities, majority culture white communities in North America, is different too. And so she hears this and is like, doesn't quite know what to say. The first makes all sort of the normal noises that you're supposed to make. But as it turns out, he's sort of got a chip on his shoulder. And so then he basically finds her response insufficiently supportive or understanding. And so he goes off on her. And once he goes off on her, she goes off on him right back and storms out of the thing. He basically calls her a bigot and didn't go anywhere. They didn't get married. And she feels betrayed because, hey, this is a pretty big deal. You should have told me about this before you asked me to marry you, because a little bit of disclosure here, buddy. And he's like, well, she obviously is a bigot, and, she needs to be far more open-minded to be married to me. Well, maybe that's true. She has a point. Where do you go with this? Life is like that. Now, if he were living in a culture, let's say, like when I was young, when there was quite a bit more social stigma and pressure against same-sex behavior, maybe he would have had less opportunity. Maybe he wouldn't have had, actually culminated in many male relationships. And so maybe at some point he would say, yeah, sometimes, maybe he wouldn't have told her that every now and then he looks at a guy and thinks, but he had never followed through. And so he had only been with women. And so would have been on the other side of the line, even though in reality he's sort of all over the place. And he was young. I mean, there's so many factors. And now the church has to sort of deal with this. And the church's basic position is, well, let's encourage young people to not have long sexual histories with lots of names on them, because that's going to get complex. Now, it's also important to remember that if you read any church history, you begin to recognize that there's a lot going on here. Saint Augustine in the West, you're really hard-pressed to find someone bigger than Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine in his younger years, something today we might at least promiscuous, maybe even a sex addict. Had a concubine, was promised to a woman when she was a child, waiting for her to maybe get into her teen years so he could marry her. He put away that marriage. He loved his concubine, had a son with his concubine, who he also loved. Turned his back on all of this because there was a wave of celibacy going through late antiquity where celibacy was the new hotness. And all sorts of young women who would have been ideal partners, to the horror of their parents, joined monasteries and married Jesus. I mean, sex is an enormously messy business. I know that sounds funny, but romance, dating, marriage, it's enormously difficult. We seem to be reverting into somewhat of a pre-Christian culture now, where you didn't have categories of gay or straight in Roman antiquity. You just, people just had sex. And Roman culture, basically, the one who's doing the penetrating has dominance over the one who's being penetrated, male or female. So this is such a huge issue, and so much of the debates want to sort of close to give clear answers. Now, clear answers are really nice because they're clear. Clear answers are really hard to live with because life isn't clear. And so each of us makes choices. And this runs the gamut. So Mike Pence decides he's not going to do lunch with women if somebody else isn't there. Okay, there's a clear line. Totally understand that clear line. Nobody's running around making charges against Mike Pence like they are against Andrew Cuomo. Did I get the right Cuomo? Governor Cuomo. Because Mike Pence follows a rule. Cuomo doesn't. Cuomo's making all kinds of comments. Yep, it's kind of got you in trouble. But he's doubling down and not backing down. So whether it's same sex or not, these issues are tough. And we all want freedom and choice. Well, congratulations, you've got it. You have to decide what to do. And the difficulty is that every decision you make will have a consequence. And generally speaking, the church says chastity and abstinence, they'll do you pretty good. But there are always consequences. So I'm sure I'll get into more of that. I've got a live stream I'm going to be doing with a particular group. I'm sure they're going to have lots of questions like this, and that'll give you an idea of my stance. Because, people come to me and say, Pastor, what should I do? I don't know. I'm not you. I'll lay out some of the territory of what I know. But you get to decide. I have that with people who come to me. Their marriage is miserable. And they're like, Pastor, should I divorce? I don't know. I'm not going to tell you because you have a better view on, how this will harm the children. You're the one that your life is going to, you're the one that is either going to be rewarded by your decision or pay the penalty. Probably both. So I'll give you as much wisdom as I have. I'll tell you what I think the Bible says, but you may or may not listen to me anyway. So don't act like I have agency in this. No, you do. So I'll try to help as best I can. All right. Ben K. Ooh, 2 questions from Ben K. What are we? 1123. The questions just keep coming. Ben K. Recently finished Brett Sockold's book on transubstantiation. It was very helpful in getting to new frameworks for understanding sacraments. I thought so too. On infant baptism, trying to understand the sign and signified framework is one that can help differentiate the infant baptism approach from the adult believer baptism. I was baptized as an infant in the Lutheran Church. Was confirmed, but I don't feel like I really believed until I was in college. I'd have to say that's quite true of me too. The more literal readings of the Bible I was doing at the time, and the group churches I was around at the time did believers' baptism, so in my early 20s, I was baptized again. Heretic. Little did I know the Anabaptist tradition was a relatively young one in the history of the church at the time. Now with young children, I'm second-guessing what baptism really signifies. Before I thought it was a public declaration of one's faith. No, that's what believers' baptism says it is. With infant baptism, I'm starting to see it's God's providence of inviting children to partake in the covenant community even without their earning it. That's exactly right. How would you explain the role purpose of infant baptism? I think you just did. It is so a little earlier in your thing you said, I was baptized as an infant in the Lutheran Church, was confirmed, but I don't feel like I was really believed until I was in college. And that's where you get into the funniness of the believed thing. Because do you really believe in innocence or in options? So in some sense, the innocent or naive is the true believer because they're not conflicted in any way. So there's true belief. Now, when you get to college, you finally affirmed it with your will in a way that you hadn't before, even in your confirmation, which means that in some ways there was doubt, and you actually had to overcome your doubt with your decision making and your agency. Is that also belief? I would say it's sort of a different kind of belief. And so the belief that you had as a child growing up in the Lutheran Church was a certain sort of belief, which in some ways is superior. It's innocent. It's non-conflicted. You believed like a child. Childlike faith, isn't that the kind of faith we want? Then as a college person, you looked at the menu, looked at the options and said, I've thought through this. I believe. Now we're using the same word, but is it really the same thing? Now you have another level of belief. Now, that second level of belief is a really powerful thing because when you were a child believing innocently, when others would come around, you would look at them and say, they just don't believe like I do. Jesus is my Savior. I'm going to heaven when I die. He's coming back. I can recite the Apostles' Creed without a wince or a hitch. That's the faith of a child. Now, as an adult, you're going through that Apostles' Creed and you're thinking, So someone comes up to the child and says, I don't know if I can buy that second coming business. Child looks at them, you heretic. Why don't you believe? Belief is easy. As a college student, someone says, I don't know about that second coming. It's been 2,000 years. He's still a no-show. You could say, yeah, I get that. But I still believe for these reasons. In other words, this belief number two, I'm doing a 1 and 2 thing again. This belief number two, this non-innocent, non-naive belief, has capacities to it that the childlike belief didn't have. And it's a good thing now that you have that. And you might lament the innocence that is lost. It's worthy of lament. Innocence and naivete are a beautiful thing. But at the same time, now you have a capacity that Christ can use to bless your neighbor. That's a good thing too. So, no, I'm still down in the infant baptism category, even though I know that it's messy. And it also is the symbolic representation. Let's say you baptize a child and the child goes to college and rejects the belief system that they were raised in. It's a common thing. And Christians struggle with that. As someone who practices infant baptism, I can say, okay, but, the church, Christ through the church made some promises there. You can lean into them. And the truth is that someone goes to they're dedicated as a child perhaps in the Baptist church, and then at 7th or 8th grade they were baptized, and then they go to college and deconstruct. I don't find waiting for believer baptism as necessarily a solution to the deconstruction issue. I find people who are baptized as children, teenagers, or adults able to deconstruct just as well as people who are baptized as infants. So I see it as a wash. One more question. In Brett's book, I couldn't help notice that much of the ecumenical dialogue occurs within the upper tiers of the church hierarchy. Most of the councils and meetings he references were Catholic and Anglican and other denominations reaching agreements. Would only conclude the top of the hierarchy of each church theologically. Have you seen any organized ecumenical initiatives directed to the laity? It's called evangelicalism. In my experience, I've seen far more division among this group than among the clergy. Maybe it's just a function of numbers, but I find these perceived differences in denominations are often so hard for people to get over, myself included, especially when we don't understand what those real or perceived differences may or may not be. Ecumenical dialogue seems to be a byproduct of your channel, yes. But even your followers don't seem to be the average Joes of the church. That's probably because it's partly because of me, and partly because of Peterson, and partly because of Pajot. We're a pretty wonky bunch. A lot of this has to do with, I want to make a video about platforms, because, and you found this in my recent videos, I've made a variety of comments about platforms, that the church used to be the platform, and there were authority structures, and at least in terms of what we can see through history, the authority structures were to one degree or another fairly coherent. We now live in a world of numerous platforms, and that's why I'll make the point, the Southern Baptist Convention is having a fight over women in church office. Okay, but anybody can get a YouTube channel, and if you're smart, if you're clever, if you're good looking, if you've got the right turns of phrase, if you have the right charisma, you can be far more influential in the Southern Baptist Convention than any local church pastor in, godforsaken corner of Oklahoma someplace. Oh, we're not going to let a woman be a pastor of that church. Oh, but Beth Moore is probably more influential in the Southern Baptist Convention than anyone in the Southern Baptist Convention's hierarchy, which is not really a hierarchy. And in my conversations with Brett Sockold and Cale Zeldin, to what degree have traditional hierarchies, like the Roman Catholic hierarchy, been disrupted by technological platforms? Who really is more influential, Bishop Barron or some cardinal in North America? I know who Bishop Barron is. I can't name a standing cardinal in North America. What does that say? I know who Brett Sockold is. I know who Bishop Barron is. Those platforms are creating communities. And the church really hasn't done much thinking theologically with respect to this. And so what evangelicalism, in many ways, and this happens in the American frontier, is that that's sort of an ecumenical movement among the laity. It's what it is. And when basically, the story of evangelicalism on the American frontier is that you had these mostly European dissenting churches on the eastern seaboard in the colonial America. And then, the part of the reason for the American Revolution is that, very quickly after the American Revolution, people wanted new land, because the promise of America was you could just go there and get land. You couldn't get land in Europe. So if you had a gun, or if you had an army behind you, or if you had something, or if you had smallpox clearing your way, you could go into the American frontier and carve out a new space. Now, you had to deal with the original inhabitants and all of those things, but Americans were going over the Appalachians and finding, the West was Western Massachusetts, and eventually over the Appalachians into Kentucky and Tennessee and this area. But the churches were all on the East Coast. And so as that happened, people took their beliefs with them, and now suddenly you're out there in the frontier, and the church hasn't caught up with you. But you're still sort of Christian. So what do you have? You have the Bible. Just the Bible. not scholars, not people who know theology, not a lot of books, just the Bible. And so you have this, now suddenly you have a new tradition of Bible churches starting in the frontier. And, that then will get caught up in evangelicalism and sawdust revivals and awakenings and. And so those traditional church structures with all those hierarchies and with all those theologians, that all takes a lot of time to develop. And even today, when you look at sort of the frontiers of evangelicalism, there was a study a number of years ago that noted that when it came to church planters and church planting, a seminary education was a negative indicator of success. What did that mean? It meant that your most successful church planters, success meaning you start a church, you start preaching, you bring in, a guitarist and some music, and you basically do the revival every Sunday. People who had theological degrees did worse than people who didn't. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of the things that getting a theological degree does is make you careful. Being a spontaneous preacher that can really rally a crowd and mobilize a base and bring tears to eyes and touch hearts, that's usually a lot about instinct and working off the cuff, not theological precision. And so I would have to say that there's both ecumenicity on the ground, which is sort of most easily affected by being sort of a sola scriptura church, Bible alone. And it just takes a lot, again, I told the story before. So a colleague of mine up in Roseville became good friends with the Orthodox priest up there. And I just had to chuckle when my colleague had an icon in his office. I thought, oh, our theological ancestors would roll over in their grave at the thought of a Christian Reformed minister as an icon in his office. But so my friend was a church planter, and he had a theological education, and he didn't by no means had the most successful church plant in Roseville or Rockland, California, because that's a place in Sacramento where you have these big mega churches that pop up and get thousands of people. And my friend was quite successful for a Christian Reformed pastor. He got hundreds of people, but that's probably part of his theological sophistication and education. So he's, strikes up a really tight relationship with this Orthodox priest. And one day the conversation gets around to evangelism. And the priest says to him, "We're not doing evangelism." "What do you mean you're not doing evangelism?" "We're not ready to do evangelism." "What do you mean you're not ready to do evangelism?" "No, we've got to build our cathedral and our monasteries, and we're not ready to build the infrastructure for evangelism to commence." Yeah. That's sort of the way it goes. But, you don't escape these things. So now, in many ways, Jonathan Pageau is a YouTube evangelist for the Orthodox Church. And he's doing it without a cathedral. And he's carving icons on a live stream. So he's very evangelical, in a way. He's also Orthodox. So that's where these things get funny. And this estuary, Bridge of Meaning Discord, around my channel, same kind of dynamics. It's just the cathedrals are now catching up to the frontier. Any comments or anyone from the voice chat? You guys have been very quiet today. All right, I'll keep going. In reference to your recent videos on Brett, his view seems to be, I think Brett Weinstein, not Brett Sockold. His view seems to be that we had an opportunity to transcend what we are in the sense of overcoming, repressing our biological drives. But if your purpose is to transcend what you are, does that not imply that you are not what you are? Exactly. In other words, if you must transcend biological processes, does that not infer that there is a part of you that itself transcends biology? That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And Brett, in his conversation with Alistair McGrath, has a huge capacity to note human beings have the genetic track and the culture track. And Jordan Peterson gets into this very clearly too, how for human beings, these two tracks come together. And when you get to the whole transgender thing, in a lot of ways, that fight is between the culture track and the biology track. We've had part of the reason the whole woke intersectional house cannot stand is because if you just sit back and watch and listen for not too long, you can see all of the conflicts within. So there's all this body positivity, fat studies. Your body is perfect the way it is. Okay, but in your same movement, you have this activistic strain that is going to do real damage and violence to the body via drugs and surgery. You just finished saying that your body is perfect the way it is, and now you're going to cut off penises and breasts. That doesn't cohere. And now people who see it doesn't cohere might pull their hair out and say, why can't they see? Give them time. They'll see. That's the thing about incoherence. It just keeps manifesting. And so these are the issues. Oh, Vixen Dixon gave a nice donation. Thank you, Vixen Dixon. And Jamie Russell, another donation this week. So thank you both. Gotta love Vixen Dixon. She's one of a kind out there, I'll tell you. So much fun. I wake up every morning and did Vixen Dixon win again? So thank you both. Where was I? Oh, biology. Yes. I imagine his response would be that we must overcome biological drives in order to prevent our self-caused extinction. And in this sense, the transcending of biological drives is actually still serving as a part of the reproductive biological process, the continuation of the genome through time. But then why has biology given us a choice to make? Exactly. Or is it even a choice to make? See, this is where also let's call it the foundational materialists run into problems as well. Because is it just biology? Is it just our coding? You can't step outside yourself to gain a perspective to answer these questions within their framework. Their framework is trapped within itself. Whereas a theistic framework has at least the possibility that God knows and we don't, and so we can learn and become more like God. That's the advantage of a theistic network. With Brett's system, you can't finally know if Brett imagining he's transcending his code is just another part of the code that the assassin robot has built into himself. So let's play with a Terminator movie, because that kind of is where this goes. So let's imagine that Arnold gets captured in the future world and reprogrammed and sent back into the other world to save the young lad from the other Terminator that gets brought back. So this is Terminator 2. And let's imagine that the Terminators thought this through and so put a vulnerability into the code that could be exploited by the future revolutionaries so that Arnold does go back thinking he's protecting the boy, but in protecting the boy, what he's actually doing is making the robot supremacy inevitable. That's in some ways the plot of the Matrix trilogy. I mean, you can just keep going down these loops and there is no bottom. And so what theism basically says is there's a bottom and we can't get there and we should trust it. Instead of turtles all the way down, there is a bottom. There's a bottom. There is a frame in which you are working. And, you know, Brett cannot avoid the thought, maybe he doesn't have it, but it's not unavoidable, that his own experience of transcending his program is yet another level of programming. And again, that's what you see in the Matrix movie. Because, okay, so in the second movie, Neo, you know, in the Nebuchadnezzar Zion frame of reality, finds that he can stop the monsters there just like he can in the Matrix. So in other words, maybe it's all a Matrix. And you can't escape that. If we must still transcend it to preserve it, why are we given the option? Why are we given the tools by biology, but then in his opinion still have an option whether or not to use them? And what does this mean in a kind of degree regarding animals and humans and their telos? Exactly. So Brett's a brilliant guy. I don't know why he can't see this. It doesn't seem like such a hard thing to see. What's the relationship between conscience and belief? Oh boy, it's 11:46. That's a good question, Christian. Maybe you can answer it. I don't know if I can do it right now. That would, there's another hour and a half answer. But it's a great question. Conscience, they're both deeply important yet slippery concepts. You don't have conscience without belief, and your conscience forms your beliefs. So they're both impacting each other all the time, especially as you grow, because we talked about this sort of naive belief that you might have. So in your naive belief, you have beliefs and you have a conscience, and conscience is the voice of God and belief is the world of God. It's a very simple world without cross pressures. And then doubt creeps in to the garden. You eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And now you start to question your conscience, and you start to question your beliefs, and you start bringing in rationality, and you start studying the Word of God, and you do all of this. Now suddenly your conscience is more complicated. It used to be that eating meat was wrong. Now you can eat some meats and not others. But every time you eat meat, because you used to believe that eating meat was wrong, you still have this little hitch in your conscience when you eat meat. But then you go and you have a vision of a sheet coming down from heaven, and there's all sorts of unclean animals in there, and the voice says, kill and eat. And you say, I've never touched unclean animals. Well, we just keep going. All right. Hi, Paul. Hope you're well. How important is it, in your opinion, that an individual's members' beliefs line up with their denominational confession? Oh, we talked about with Robert about that. Did I just answer a whole bunch of questions I had answered before? I hope not. Maybe I did. I don't know, but I hope they were helpful. Okay.
Yeah, Paul, I'm pretty sure you did. I actually changed my answer from 2 weeks ago. That was different, but I'm pretty sure all the other ones were the same.
Did I just answer 2 hours of questions I'd answered before, and nobody in the chat room said, Vanderclay, you idiot, move down the queue? You know, poor.
Well, yeah, you always riffing in a helpful way, so we found no reason to object.
Rick, you're supposed to stop me from doing these things. Now Rick is going to be all upset because we have even more questions to answer. Oh, wow.
Oh, you should scroll to the very bottom.
Okay.
And answer my question about Calvin.
Okay. Oh, you're visiting Calvin on Monday. Are there any spots you'd recommend seeing or places I can say, Paul Vanderclay was here? Well, I was a campus cop, and so I'll tell you, I was everywhere. And to me, Calvin College is a wonderful place, one of my happy places. But I've been gone for a long time, and so not everyone there will remember me. If you'll run into Bill Corner, who's the chief of campus security, I helped train him as a campus cop before he became a real cop and then back to Calvin College. Maybe there are good restaurants and things to do. Arnie's, I don't know if Arnie's is still open. Midtown has Yesterdogs. They're fun. You're visiting Calvin on Monday. I hope you have a good trip. There are many good people at Calvin, and you know, knock on Kristen Dumais' door and tell her Paul Vanderclay says hi.
All right.
And I wish her well. I really do. I mean, people, you know. So here's the thing: if you have a professor and you hand in work and the professor gives you a bad grade, that's part of the game. And you know, I wanted to like this book a lot more than I did, but maybe I'll like her next one. Who knows? We want to be able to relate to each other this way. You know, Joey has not yet come down to Living Stones, thrown himself on the thrown himself on the stage in front. We don't have an altar, we're Reformed. And made himself a Christian. I haven't even got a chance to baptize Rick yet, for Pete's sake.
I tried, but it was a Saturday by accident, and then I changed my mind. So maybe next time.
I refuse to let politics or religion make me stop loving people. So I'm going to love Rick, and I'm going to love Joey, and I'm going to love Kristen DeMay, and I'm going to love you, Richard. And I think that's part of what Christianity affords us, to love our enemies, because we battle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. So I want to go after principalities and powers with everything I have, but with people, gotta love them, baby. Gotta love them. So.
Try and trick Joey into going to a Seventh-day Adventist church. That way he won't have the same excuse.
Well, the guy who, Vlad, who bought the lobster, he's Seventh-day Adventist. He comes every now and then. We even named him Bucko here. So anyway, yeah, any other, gosh, I repeated all the questions. I feel like such an idiot. Oh, well. Now we have just lots more questions to do in the future.
The questions are just prompts anyway. We just listen to hear you rant.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Oh, gosh.
That's why we love you, Paul. So.
Any other new questions for the last 5 minutes you'd like me to? Any hot takes you want?
I'll take a hot take on my view on Michael Servetus. because it seems to me that when you look at Calvin and Servetus, one of them seems more like Caiaphas and the other one seems more like Jesus. And it seems to me that most Christians have the wrong one as the wrong one.
I've been reading this, you've seen it pop up in my videos, this book, Reformations, and he actually did a really nice treatment on Servetus. And I learned a lot more about Servetus than I did before. There's this funny thing that happens in the Reformation where, the reformers are persecuted by the Roman Catholics, and then the reformers go ahead and persecute people just like the Roman Catholics persecuted them. And of course, a lot of those are the Anabaptists who are, getting a bad deal from both sides. Now, some of those Anabaptists, John of Leyden at Munster, that was one crazy business. So I can understand why the simulation turned on John of Leyden. But no, we learn through time, and in some ways the Anabaptists did a lot of winning by their suffering, and both Roman Catholics and magisterial reformers would look at the Anabaptists and just kind of scratch their heads, because it's like, boy, they sure are acting a lot more Christian than we are. But all of that has been, has come to reform the Roman Catholics and the magisterial reformed communities too. So there's, one of the, I talked about this in my conversation with Brett and Kale recently. Christianity has a way of losing in the short term and winning in the long term. And the difficulty is that long term is usually quite a bit longer than the lifespan of any of us as individuals. And it makes perfect sense if you understand that and you look at the kinds of things Jesus says and you look at the framework of the story. Jesus loses his culture war. He just does. And yet Jesus just seems to keep gaining ground slowly as the world turns. And again, it goes to, you can't wield him and use him, because you can't wield a loser, but he keeps winning. So yeah, no, point well taken, Jacob. Point well taken. And it's, in that way, you sent me that, I think it was you that sent me that video. Caiaphas had a point. And in fact, the book of Acts says the Holy Spirit was speaking through him when he made that point. And it's a valid point. Do you want to, and this is what I say to, probably in my camp, there's more anti-woke than woke. Do you want to perpetuate the woke cause? Be an anti-woke jerk. You will give the woke strength. Do you really want to overcome evil? Overcome evil with good, not with evil. You don't beat racism with more racism. You don't beat error with more error. You beat evil with good. You beat hatred with love, not more hatred. They say, well, yeah, that might get you dead. Well, that's kind of the point of Christianity. It does get you dead. But if you believe in the resurrection, there are worse things besides dead. And that idea has, also migrated out in lots of different ways. So, all right, it is 11:58. Any other hot take questions anybody wants to throw in there? I can't believe I just repeated all the same questions. I'm gonna go back and cry on Rick's shoulder as I beat his chest. I say, Rick, you didn't tell me. He didn't.
I did have. Oh.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Comment. I had a comment on the. So I was looking at the days before and prior to Sunday, and I don't know if there's any like highest to lowest or lowest to highest symbolism with like Good Thursday being when you were talking about the body, I was thinking about this that Good Thursday there's oh wait, not Good Thursday, Holy Thursday, there's like the washing of the feet, right? Is that the is that the scene that's like focused on for Good Thursday, or one of them?
Depends on the tradition, but yeah, there's Maundy Thursday. But yeah, I mean, because a lot of, so you're looking at John 13, and John 13, of course, begins with Jesus washing their feet. And
Okay.
so Maundy Thursday is often a day when, so my friends who are liturgy purists will tell me, there will recoil in horror that we partake in communion on Good Friday. I said, no, you're supposed to do that on Maundy Thursday. Oh, okay. Living Stones, we're a mess. We just are, and we live by grace because we're a mess.
Okay. Yeah, it was. I was just looking at that, like, there's the point that might be, the lowest, or associated with somebody at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, and then like the 3 days, or on Sunday you have like the crucifixion, and then 3 days after that, the resurrection, or something that might be associated with like the highest. And then just the fact that the crucifixion is the center point between those days, I thought was interesting.
Yeah. So my friend Eric Dirksen, he knows liturgy. So if you want a church that does liturgy right, you got to drive to Davis. And if in Sacramento you want a church that doesn't know what they're doing with respect to liturgy, you can come to Living Stones and be messed up with us. All right. Any other things? Eric, did you have something, Eric?
Yes, I did. I was just one of those past couple of conversations, the materiality, the trueness of an arrow. And when we're talking about the trueness of the arrow, we're talking more about the path that the flight takes.
Right.
And I was thinking that on one hand, yes, but I was hoping you would hedge that with the fact that the actual materiality of the straightness of the arrow itself, the fletching, all those sorts of things, there is an maybe inseparable tie between the materiality and the flight path. So I just was hoping that would, I don't know, do you have anything to add to that? Or
No, that's a good point. I really like that, because they all cohere together. The trueness of the flight path. If you have a crappy arrow, it's not going to fly true. Although
a true marksman might be able to work with that even still, because he's that skilled.
Yeah, but he's overcoming something, rather than, a true marksman will look at the arrows available and say, if I want to hit the target, I'll pick the best arrow so that I can hit the target. A true marksman might say, all of these arrows are crap. This arrow is at least crappy in a way that I can work with, and so I'll use that. So, yeah, it's a good point.
And of God.
What's that?
And of God, he picks the vector flawed and makes your path straight anyway.
That's right. I like, it's funny in The Princess Bride when, Inigo Montoya is fighting Wesley, and they both start fighting with their opposite hand, and it's just you want to watch someone who's tremendously skilled. You watch them do things one-handed or blindfolded, it just makes the glory greater. So, well, I think that's probably enough for today, and at least for the live stream. So for those of you who have been following the live stream, thank you for joining us, and appreciate the super chats. That's been very generous. Yeah, somebody had something they wanted to say?
Paul, I got that wrong. Holy Thursday is not 3 days from the celebrated day of the crucifixion, because Good Friday is the day of the celebrated crucifixion.
Right.
So I can, yeah. So I got that wrong, and I can be symbolically crucified myself here.
I'd rather not crucify you, Shane. we'd rather keep you around to do all the fun things that you do. So, thank you all for joining us, and be well. And next week, hopefully, I will answer new questions that are old. So maybe I'll catch up, and yeah. So God bless you all, and may you be well. Okay, Rick, you can end transmission.